Okay, well, welcome everybody to Chalkwell Hall and to Metal's third salon in the series Sense of Place. As you can see, today Chalkwell Hall is arranged in a very different way than normal, and that's because Metal are opening this special cafe called Cafe Valise, which is going to be open for the next 6 weeks over the summer holidays. It's Metal's pop-up travelling cafe. It's been in Peterborough, it's come to Southend. It opens on the 21st of July, Saturday, till the 2nd of September, from 10 till 4 every single day. And there's going to be delicious cakes, coffees and all sorts of art events, so do pop in over the summer. But tonight we're here for the Literary Salon. We've been looking this year at A Sense of Place, and tonight we've got some really fantastic speakers for you. A very creative mixed bunch of poets, artists, writers, photographers and filmmakers who have all been making really extraordinary work which looks at our very unique and special landscape of the Thames Estuary. And it just feels to me that there's never been a more important time to be looking at this and examining it and treasuring this very special landscape. So it's my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker of the night, Jemanda Speedwell. She's an irrepressible collector of language and terminology and keeps her accumulations of place names, nautical terms and botanical expressions safely preserved in verse form, packed together tightly with plosives, alliteration and rhythm. Over 2,000, yes, it was a big word and I couldn't say it. Over 2007 to 2008, she explored the Thames Estuary and wrote a collection of pieces on the area's place names, shipping movements and avian activity, which she'll be reading from, as well as a more recent project on Shelley. Jemanda now works as a word artist and writer in residence on different projects. Her absurdly wide interests include ship spotting, bat watching, fluvial exploration, no idea what that is, architectural decoration, and both etymology and entomology. So please give a warm welcome for Jemanda Speedwell.
Thank you very much. The word that she was missing is assonance. Assonance and alliteration. Okay, I'll start by reading you a piece which is basically a list of place names and physical features of the Thames Estuary. Everything from sandbanks and settlements, street names to names of the reaches of the river. It includes nicknames, local names, some archaic or obsolete names, some of places or features which no longer exist, and there's also some newly created names in there. And I found all these on maps, both very old maps and current maps, in books and on exploring the Thames Estuary, chancing upon things and on asking people as I met them, as I came across them. I've called it the rise and fall of the Lower Hope. The Lower Hope is, if you don't already know where that is, it's the first bend in the Thames as you're coming in from the sea. So, as I'm sure you know, there's a sea reach and it eventually bends, that's the Lower Hope, before it turns into Tilbury, etc. Hope in river terms means a haven or a sanctuary. And because it was a bend off the main river and it narrowed, it was, what still is, more sheltered and calm. So ships would anchor there, waiting for the tide to turn or the weather to calm. I have never quite found out why it's called the Lower Hope. It sounds almost like a contradiction, Lower Hope. I think it's probably because of it being in the Lower Thames. There are other hopes further up. There's Northfleet Hope, for example.
Well, Stamford no hope.
Yes. And I think it's one of my favourite stretches. I think it's certainly one of the most atmospheric. On both sides there's open land. You've got the Coo Peninsula on the south side, and you've got country parks, East Tilbury on the north side, old fortifications. And because it narrows, the ships seem to come very close. It's a fantastic place for watching ships. And it also has a bell buoy. So as you're standing there, you hear an atmospheric tolling that sounds like there's a church on the other side of the river, but it's the bell in the river that's ringing. So, the rise and fall of the Lower Hope. Long reach to Ouse Deep, halfway road to middle ground. Small gains, great lines, the tide turns, the hope rises. Powerhouses, holiday cottages, superstores and fossil forests, pumping stations, dumping grounds, spoil heaps and water towers. The brimp, the drift, the cant, the shant, the warp, the gnaw, the gulf, the flood, fleets, creeks, guts and gores, bights, banks, hides and havens, dozens of hundreds and the lathe of scray. Pillboxes, tank traps, catalytic crackers and flare stacks, Martello towers, Maunsell forts, cold harbours and counterwalls. Shipwash, sheep washers, slipways and the sledway, the silting, shifting and switching of swatchways, defences on ramparts and wet fences on floodplains, embankments around innings and sluices out to saltings. Jubilee Marsh, Maze, Cockle Row and Borley Bay, Hearty Ferry, Bee-Nest Jetty, Bread and Cheese Hill, Humblebee Creek. Saltworks, sea marks, steelworks, paper plants, civic centres, rifle ranges, finger posts and tide gauges. Pilot boats and lighthouses, beacons leading, illuminations beckoning, to leisure centres and pleasure beaches. The Wall of Fame, eternal flame, Upnor Cupola and Capel Fleet wrapped to viewpoint. The Fruit Belt, Olympic Fringe, Beckton Alps, Angel of the South, Britannia Village, Millennium Mills, Pear of the Year and the Lantern of Kent. The Winter Garden, Water Circus, Pleasant Terrace, Prospect Villas, the Lower Hope Fills and the Bellboy Rings. Landing stages, travelling gantries, fairways, conveyors, causeways and crossings. Fast track at Dartford, an influx to Ebbsfleet, Mulberry Harbour barges and the Kentish Flats wind farm. Paraffin Station, Telegraph Hill, Knut's Canal and the Knockjohn Channel, rhino ramps and pilot pick-up points at the Spit, Sunk and Warp, the East Atlantic Migratory Flyway and the Greenway over the Northern Outfall. Lines of pylons, lengths of promenades, substations and interchanges, but no runway on the Broomway, and no mast upon St Margaret's, no road to Shade House, no way through stray marshes. Anthills, tank farms, boat yards and yacht clubs, workshops, business parks, builders' centres and breakers' yards. Projections of spits and estuarine bluffs, ballast pits and mussel beds, mud pans and gutters, chalk quarries, clay basins, abandoned forts and empty batteries. A great cascade of wave-breaking blocks, warning buoys of riverbed wrecks, a flood barrier footing on fobbing horse, and high-rise flats on submarine berths. Pudding Pan, Shivering Sand, Kentish Knock, Pointer's Point, London Loop and Lappel Bank, Mucking Bight, Dagenham Reach, Gray's Gorge, Gog's Berth, Bugsby's Reach and Harry's Bench. The Dartford Tunnel, the Barking Barrier, Ingress Abbey, Fort Borstal, Devil's Elbow or Cupid's Corner. Detention centres, self-storage, demolition sites and memorial halls, isolation hospitals, visitor centres, interpretation boards and danger areas. Bunkers, bird hides, barracks and caravan sites, welcome halls to shopping malls, but no one's allowed on New England Island. Clarksard, Clog Bank, Crowstone, Sunk Sand, Black Stakes, Rat's Bay, Slag Slope and Wallop Stone, the half-blocked Bullnose and a hulk at Horrid Hill, Bedlam's bottom mudflats by Bobbing, and parting gut breaking off towards Throbbing. Rough grazing, live firing, Environment Agency obligatory signage of slippery surfaces, sudden drops and strong currents, warnings of crosswinds to Sheppey, and listings of losses at Great Lines, a strong ripple noted at Drillstone, and a broken beacon at the point of Lower Hope. Breakneck Hill, Spit End Hyde, Sleigh Hills Marsh, Slaughterhouse Point, Hangman's Wood and Deadman's Island. There's lulls and levels as the Lower Hope falls, from Holehaven, Hidden Pool to Hollow Shore, and nothing to drink now the Tidal Basin Tavern is dry. Twiddle Pit, Thistle Hill, Yantlet Flats and Mapland Sands, Hadley Ray, Fiddler's Reach, South East Mouse, the Roach, the Crouch, the Barter Estate, the Saxon Shore Way, Waterman's Stone and Lambard's Wall, the hamlet of All Hallows, the 4 Fathoms Channel, Peculiar People's Chapel and Oddfellows Hall. Country parks on landfall sites and apartment blocks on concrete plants, bird lagoons, boat marinas, wet depressions and water features. 4 Wents, Twin Tumps, 2 Tree Causeway, 1 Tree Hill, Fisherman's Gat, Lumnam Gut, Bowwaters Bollock and Guncotton Folly, Chafford Hundred, Lakeside Thurrock, Ocelot Docks and Botany Quarry. Rainbow Lane to the Lower Hope leads, and to the World's End the Lower Hope sends. There's halls and fences, entries to fortresses, batterings of buttresses and breaches of breakwaters. Water Lane, Marine Parade, Ripple Road, Atlantis Close, the Bellboy tolls and the Hope overflows. Behind each of those names is a story, most of which I did find out when I was researching that. Some sad stories, some very interesting ones, and some where the language has been corrupted in a funny way. That piece was written as part of the Soundings from the Estuary project, which I did back in 2008 with photographer Frank Watson and a sound artist, Dave Lawrence. And I put my pieces together in this booklet. Another topic I researched in detail for that project was shipping of the Thames, the names of the ships, where they were going, the cargoes they were carrying, and I wrote a couple of very in-depth pieces on those, which I won't read you now. But I've continued to be fascinated by ships, and whenever I'm on the Thames, I'm always watching to see who's there, trying to catch the name, and these days I know quite a lot of them. I might know where they're going or what they're carrying. They're like familiar characters now. And particularly exciting was finding out that you could follow the journeys of ships over the internet. So using various websites, you can zoom in to see an icon of a ship which is superimposed on a map of the world, and follow ships, see where they're going, what they're doing. That gave me the idea for a project I did in Queenborough this winter. Who knows Queenborough, the Isle of Sheppey? Okay, yes you do, I remember. yeah. If you don't know it, it's a small harbour town. It's a historic town, but very much a yachting and a boating place. It's got a good-sized fishing fleet as well, but not many people know about Queenborough. It's an interesting place, but like many of these towns, it struggles in winter. It just lives for the summer. In my project, I collected sightings of ships that we could see from the harbour, so ships going down the Swale and the Medway. And each of those ships we would follow on the internet over the subsequent 2 to 4 weeks. So every day we got to see where our ships were in the world. It's absolutely fascinating. So I used that information, as well as the other things I found on Queenborough, lots of the local boats, local yachts and rowing boats, to write the piece I'm going to read you. And the other thing that really struck me when I was at Queenborough, each time I went down to the harbour, I always had my attention taken by turnstones, which are those dear little waders, which are usually down on the foreshore, picking through all the debris and the weed. Who knows turnstones? Yeah. The nice thing about them is they're relatively tame for a wader. They won't fly away instantly. You can actually watch them from a few feet away if you stay quite still. And the other nice thing is they have some good alternative names. The ebb pecker and tangle picker, which are names used in different parts of the country, which are just so appropriate. So I also made up a few names of my own, and I also learnt that the red shank is called, well, one of its local names is the go-away bird, because unlike the turnstone, it takes alarm at the slightest movement. It'd be the first bird to fly up shrieking, and it will scare all the other birds away as well. So that's called the go-away bird, and that gave me the idea to call the turnstone the comeback bird. It's always the first to come back, and it's... So, tea first. So this is called the Shipping News Queenborough Winter 2012. Am I allowed to say that? 2012. Slips and hards, mudbanks and floodgates, cocklers, ketchers, trawlers and dredgers, at Swale Ness, Mary's Hole, Chalk Wharf and Horse Shoal, passing ships navigating channels and offloading cargoes, while teams of turnstones twitch for insects on tide lines. Hunky-dory, Ruby 40, Scoden, Skeetwell, Why Not, Donk, Sir Hendrick, Miss Muffet, Hurricane, Harvey Jane and Gwendolyn. Liz Ann in the scrubbing berth, Hobbit in the harbour yard, Amity overwintering on woodblocks, and Sexburger trundled on a trailer down the Hard. A black ship slips down the creek, a fire launch speeds up the swale, the harbour controller patrols the moorings, and beachcombing stone-turners sift through ridges of dead vegetation. Trot boats and pier ports, masts struck on barges and spud legs on Samson. A new mizzen boom is made for the White Moth, and a shipwright shapes trunnels for the Triton. Car carriers loom over Lappel Bank, with Porgy perceived through the Abbot Lab Gap. A container ship shape is made out in the mist, and a careful watch kept for the vigilant. Pebble pushers prod rocks, shove shells, flick sprigs and leave a weed. A tug ties up at Rushington, a coaster heads for Hull. A bulk carrier leaves for Barking Creek, and a tanker anchors at the Tongue. Lady Mary to Grovehurst Jetty, Wilson tees down Saltpan Reach, Svitzer Victory manoeuvring in the Medway, Eleanor entraining at the All-Tide Landing. Lady Clara loops Long Point's length, Aquilian sets out for Faversham, a rowing gig turns at Colwasher Wharf, and a Bennett's barge arrives at Ridham. Coasters and carriers deliver gravel to Grain, gypsum to Kemsley and coal to Kingsnorth. Sacks of raked whiteweed for fish tanks and fake ferneries are unloaded in Queenborough Creek, and ebb peckers pick through piles of tidings and tug at tangles of algae. A warning call from the go-away bird startles the shore and shocks the flocks up in black and white patterns. Burke shipper bears for the North Sea, ever strong to the English Channel. Celtic forester rounds the coast of Brittany. Scott mariner cuts through the sound of Mull. Hyundai Splendor makes the Strait of Gibraltar, ever smart the Mediterranean. Alsala enters the Suez Canal, and Washington Express arrives at Charleston. Venus Spirit passes Freetown, Union Pluto heads for Flushing, the City of London from Ridham to Rotterdam, and hence at Kloppenburg between Thamesport and Hamburg, with tangled pickers pecking at stranded bands of bladderwrack, dashing at wave ebbs to dabble in freshly left debris. Cutter's Dock, Smuggler's Gut, Black Stakes and Pottery Bay, upturned tenders, shut down chandlers, and shops treading water in winter. A single seal at Load and Hope, a for sale sign on a sloop. The lengthy low tides make a long wait for leaving, and there's a dash in the dusk to haul up on the hard before dark. There's rumbles and hums under wild whoops and weeps of waders out late, land lighting up, masthead lights slipping by, and a brightly lit gas ship glowing from over the bay. There's racks stowed with rowboats and anchors on land, with Freebird awaiting water, Redeemer requiring salvaging, Explorer and Plunger meant for adventure, and Winterwood awaiting spring. Burker Shipper docks back at Chatham with paper from Sweden. A fixed fishing trawler is restored to Whitstable, and the Two Suns berths at dusk with dabs, sprats, pouting and whiting. There's a race of spray past the Isle of Grain, and a wave from a friendly tender. Rowers set out in the snow off the slip, and seawater swamps the mudflats in minutes. The comeback birds again return, edged back in by the tide, till virtually surfing as they skitter off strandings and balance on weed-weighted wavelets. I forgot to explain that last line to you about the turnstones. One of the things I found most charming, why I wanted to include them, was one day the tide was almost completely in, but the turnstones, instead of flying off, they just walked on the water. The wavelets were basically solid with weed, but they just sort of ran over them just naturally as if it was sand. It was so charming, so I called them the surfing turnstones. A few minutes left, so I'll read you just a short piece. This is from Rotherhithe rather than the Thames Estuary, but it's a list of things found on the foreshore, and that's relevant to the whole Thames, especially here on the Essex coast, where much of the shoreline has been at some time rubbish dumps, which are now being exposed. So in many places you can find interesting things being exposed. So this started off, I first of all wrote a verse about things I had found on this particular stretch of foreshore at Rotherhithe, and then this year I ran a project getting other people to do some exploring on the foreshore, finding things for me to add into this. So this is the final piece with everybody's contributions in it. As the river shrivels, the foreshore stretches, exposing ship staples and sticking out stakes, chunks of chalk, bits of flint, lengths of chain and slivers of slate, pottery shards, crockery chips, mellowed and pitted yellow stock bricks, plastic canisters, caps from containers, patches of sand and cracked crazy pavings, cuttings of cables, a length of hose, weathered wood and rounded stones, thick black bottle bottoms, terracotta blocks, chimney pot pieces and a bike pump part, car tyres, ship tools, shoe soles and sea glass, a drinking straw, a rubber torch, a butterfly brooch and a coconut half. Brickmakers' names and brick brands and makes, Flettons, Fort Press, Mast and Farnley, Southwater, Haunchwood, Cliff and Whittlesea. Oyster shells, animal bones, a toy crocodile and a traffic cone, a rubber rim and uprooted road sign, the spinning shadow of the wind turbine, cup handles, pot tops and twisted steel cables, window pane pieces and churchwarden pipe bowls, crested, lettered, thistled and thorned, with seams of leaves or fluted in form, with the head of a Turk, the dome of a church or a buffalo horn, and endless lengths of segments of stems, with the odd preserved pattern on the shattered white piping. Things from the city and things from the sea, a protester's placard complaining of cuts, and timbers of ships interred in the mud, a deflated football, encrusted bike bell, splintered fishing rod and discarded crutch part, a mammal's molar and ungulate's incisor, a pair of pawns from a set of chess, rivets, bolts, rope and rags, a boat hook, a spark plug, a pocket knife and padlock, a broken off barnacle and drifted sprig of bladder rack, a fragment of a flagon from a Greenwich tavern, a pipe bowl piece from Stepney, segments of ceramics spanning Wedgwood of Estuary, remnants of roof tiles from a maker in Marseille, a beer vessel branded by a brewery in Hamburg, and a bottle embossed "No Return." Overflows trickling from river wall outlets with winding lines of widening rivulets, overlaid imprints of dog paws and bird tracks, and another forager's meandering footprints. Thank you.
Elena, thank you so very much. I'm sure for many of us here tonight it was a visual experience hearing you kind of naming all of those things in our estuary here. Well, our next speaker is Stephen Turner. His work is concerned with aspects of time and the dialogue between transience and permanence. His work often involves spending long periods in odd, abandoned places, noting the changes in the complex relationship between people and the natural environment. His projects are rooted in research which explore these themes in a variety of media. His work includes installations for Turner Contemporary Margate, Trinity Buoy Wharf in London, and the North Gallery for Contemporary Art in Sunderland, along with many other places. Stephen is going to speak to us tonight about a very special project which I was completely fascinated with. In 2005, he spent over a month living in one of the abandoned Shivering Sands sea forts, kind of, eight nautical miles off the Kent coast. And that project was kind of coordinated by a friend of mine who now runs the Whitstable Biennale, and she asked me to interview Stephen when he got off the boat after these kind of weeks and weeks of complete isolation. So that's the first time that we met, and it was a really exceptional project, and there's a beautiful website and a very lovely book that's here tonight. But anyway, Stephen's going to speak tonight about his 16-year association with the home of the estuary landscape and some of the work that it's inspired. So please give a very warm welcome to the artist Stephen Turner.
Oh, thank you very much, Rachel. Where to begin? Well, the sea forts. Shivering Sands, 8 miles off the Kent coast. If you go to the end of Southend Pier and look east, you can, with a pair of binoculars, you can actually see them on the horizon. So they're really quite prominent landmarks from wherever you are in Essex or in Kent. Built in 1941 and installed there, I think, during 1942 and 43 to defend the Thames estuary, not so much from aircraft but from German E-boats who were planting mines in the estuary. In fact, they used to fire at our own aircraft on a number of occasions, and Air Command, or Fighter Command, or Bomber Command, Fighter Command, Coastal Command, that's the word, actually forbade them from firing because they nearly shot down some American bombers once. And on the way back, the Americans, to get their revenge, dropped about 800 empty petrol cans onto Shivering Sands Fort. So there was this sort of, all this part of the mythology of the forts, which I find very interesting. They were built, I live in Gravesend on the Thames in Kent, and I've lived there since 1982, I think, 84. And I have my studio in the historic dockyard in Chatham on the River Medway. So I have this long abiding relationship with both Thames and Medway, and it is a relationship. Shivering Sands sea forts were built in Red Lion Yard in Gravesend, about half a mile from where I live. It's now been levelled, and it's been levelled for at least 12 months and nothing's happening there. But a beautiful place with lots of kind of connections back through time has been replaced with no place at all, which I find a bit sad. And the longer I live in the area, the more kind of a political animal with a small p I become in the relationship I'm forming through my art with the location. I'll have another slide. But before I say more about the sea forts, and I'll come back to them, I've had at least a 16-year-old relationship with these estuarine environments. It began with curiosity, and I had a small 8-foot dinghy, and I still do occasionally go out and explore the marshes at all states of tide and the marsh islands, which Jamenda mentioned. On the Medway, and you listed a lot of them, but it's worth repeating, these places, the names are redolent with history in the past, and hospital ships and quarantine vessels that used to be there. Bedlam's Bottom, Baxall Marsh, Horrid Hill, Bishop's Ooze, Slaughterhouse Point. I mean, these very special places which I've visited and photographed and lived on, which is important. So it begins with curiosity, leads to fascination, and that leads to affection, and it actually leads to love. And I think this place is my home, and I love it. And so deep engagement is a popular way of describing kind of approach as the study of place and nature and landscape. And I feel I've gone through deep engagement into marriage. And this is my place, and I value it, all its rough edges and all its beauties equally. And so I tend to want to be responsible for caring for it in one way or another. The Monsell Sea forts weren't my first fort. I found other forts on the Medway. And this is a picture of a place called Who Fort, and it has a matching companion across the water on a Darnet island called Darnet Fort. And I lived on Who Fort in 1996, for about 240 nights I spent on Who Fort that year. I used to come home occasionally for a bath because it can get very smelly and dirty after a while. But that was the kind of level of needing to be somewhere and needing to think about what is the nature of my relationship to the world around me. And it's about self-identity, and that's important this century when we're living in an age of crisis, really, where there's not much left to believe in. Like, a lot of people have a problem with faith and religion. Science doesn't seem to have the answers. Politics certainly doesn't. Economics is at the chute. So we're left with ourselves to believe and kind of go forward with. And so what we are is very important. And I think one thing I found by living on the marshes and with this particular bit of nature is humility. And I think humility in human action as an artist or in any form of life is actually even more important in the 21st century than it's ever been in the past. What I've tried to do on the marshes is to find a way of giving a voice to nature. So nature is mute and can't speak, but what's happening out there? So I tend to try to devise processes, I was doing it this time, to let nature record itself. It's like making a map of nature on a scale of 1 to 1 by putting canvas on the estuarine riverbed at low tide and just seeing what happens when the tide comes in to capture erosion patterns and deposition patterns, or the tiny hydrobia that live in the mud in which the birds feed on, or any of the visible signs of contaminants. I mean, it was just like a litmus test of the quality of the water. And so I used to, next slide, I take them out, and in this occasion I made an installation for a project called Tide and Change in 1997, and made 11 of these canvas tidal maps for the interior of the fort. And it was about the cycle of the tides in a circular fort, which was on display for 1 lunar month, which is to do with the cycle of the moon and which controls the tides to a great degree. And people could come and visit on a boat which couldn't follow a 9 to 5 timetable because the tides are later each day. So it was a way of tuning into nature, just actually visiting the installation. And as I said, I had plenty of time to contemplate what my work was about. It's about enabling this isolation, about focus and intensity of work, which was hard to get. I didn't take any means of communicating, and it was just wonderful and rich to be engaged in this solo way with one's surroundings. I've explored a lot of the coast. I've been from the headwaters of the Medway, all the way downriver through the Medway towns, the historic dockyard, out to the Swale, to Sheerness and the Nore. And this is an image from the Isle of Sheppey, and Francis Lord will speak about foreshores, and I was involved in that project. And this was a photograph I took from a wartime pillbox, looking out to the horizon, on which you can just about see both Red Sands Towers, more to the left and closer, and Shivering Sands Towers a little further out to the right. They are actually there if you're too far away to see them. And I've always been fascinated by these pinpricks on the horizon. What were they? And I first saw them in about 1999. And I thought at first it was a container ship, and I thought, that ship doesn't seem to be moving very far. And realised what they were, and went to my local library, coincidentally had an exhibition in the library window all about them. I thought, this is absolutely amazing. So I telephoned Coastal Command, the air sea rescue people, and said, these Monsell Seaforths, do you think you could possibly take me out to let me have a look, and for a training exercise, drop me on the top of one so I could go and have a look? And the guy spoke, said, oh sir, this sounds a fantastic idea. Probably do that for you, sir. Tell us some more. I sent a letter, it wasn't an email at the time. And eventually, about a week later, I got a call back from his superior officer. He said, we couldn't possibly take you out to the Monsell Seaforths. Our whole ethos is to save people in peril, not to imperil them. So anyway, that time it didn't happen. I'd already got Tesco's lined up locally to provide the food for 6 weeks. And, but the ideas, like creative ideas, like the waves coming in up the estuary, they kind of roll around. And it was on the surface for that point, and it disappeared, and I did other projects. And then it's like the wave with some inevitability came out, and it was on the crest again. Just at the time that there was some funding available from the Arts Council for projects like this. And we were very lucky, and we were awarded the funding to actually investigate the forts and for me to occupy them and live there and make work. And so part of what I did was to speak to other people who might have an association with them. And this man is a guy called John Proctor, who I tracked down to Stoke-on-Trent. And he was on the forts in 1943 when he was a medical orderly there. And I recorded a conversation with him about life and times in 1943 on the forts. And he gave me a lovely photograph of which he kept since then, and he let me have it, which I now have at home, which kind of gives a very different picture of the forts. And he said the men felt very isolated there. There would have been about 200 people in this group of forts, all connected, as you can see, by the catwalks. 7 towers connected by catwalks. No means of communicating by phone. There was a telephone landline, but that was only for kind of military observation use and orders. The men weren't allowed to communicate. Most of them couldn't write or read, and he said part of his job was to write letters home for them and to generally act as a counsellor. And because the War Office were very concerned that all of the people on the forts were suffering from something they called fort madness. And basically they were kind of getting really excited, overexcited, and just sort of, it's like cabin fever, which people talk about when you're kind of cut off and suddenly you're out to talk to someone. What they did was they insisted that all the men on the fort took a part. And I was in the Searchlight Tower, and I, from my reading, discovered that this was where they had art exhibitions in 1943, and there was like everyone had to take part in the exhibition as a prize of a bottle of whiskey for the winning piece of art or craft. And when the men left the forts after their 6-week tour of duty, they'd come ashore, and before they were allowed to, they were sort of all lined to present themselves, before they were allowed away, they had to present their artwork, and if they hadn't done any artwork, they weren't allowed on leave. The art was seen to be a way of like easing this kind of fort madness, and the creativity as a therapy for people being unable to express themselves in a very confined place, and I really kind of connected with it. But they had no technology to commune with people outside, and I did. I set up a website, and I wasn't in any real contact with anyone on shore, but I was able to share my own experiences and observations with people through a weblog on the seafort.org website. And we went from a standing... I was there for a World War II tour of duty. I stayed on the fort for about 5.5 weeks. And yeah, it was something. It was on a daily basis. Every night I made a weblog entry to share something of the day's meaning. The forts had seen other use since the war. And this is a scene from a 1960s TV series called Danger Man. The older people amongst you might remember it. And I felt in some ways I was having an adventure. Perhaps I was some kind of danger man myself. But I thought I'd see how it went. Of the other research I kind of did before I revealed, there was an episode of Doctor Who had been filmed out there in about 1967. And but the biggest post-war occupation had been by pirate radio in the 1960s, and Screaming Lord Sutch was on Shivering Sands Tower, broadcasting not to the nation because it didn't have a big enough transmitter, but it was broadcasting to Essex and to Kent. And I forget the name of I remember the byline for the radio station. It was Britain's first teenage station. And it was a time the BBC wouldn't broadcast more than about 2 hours a week of pop music. So the forts have a real kind of rebellious history, and in the end I became a pirate in my own occupation of them, because we couldn't establish ownership. In the end I broke in. We had an angle grinder trying to kind of open the access to the underneath of the fort so I could actually climb inside. And while that was happening, a chunk of steel fell off and hit me on the head. So I had to come back and be checked out in the hospital before I could actually go into the fort 2 days later. And so I wanted to be seen, so I had a sort of CCTV in operation all the time I was there, recording my movements about the place, because it was like, it was a sort of performative thing. I was writing these notes, and I was like being in a theatre, and the architecture was like a stage, so it was like performance architecture in a sort of odd kind of way. And when I arrived, I didn't know what to expect at all. I had taken this tent, and as I said, we broke in just as night was falling, and I couldn't find, I found this little lamp with a bit of oil, paraffin, and got some light. And I just about cleared enough space to pitch the tent, and almost thought the detritus and rubble on the floor, dead gulls, all kinds of things there. All the windows, all crystal windows were blown out, and so the wind was whistling through. And I became very much about recording what was there, like forensically looking at the detritus on the floor and the marks on the walls. And very carefully exploring the space, and I limited myself to one room. For the first 4 days I was only in the room where the tent was, and I didn't go anywhere else. And when I felt I'd explored that space, I let myself into the next room, so there was always this excitement of another room to go into over the 5.5 weeks I was there. And I felt like a kind of explorer in my own little world in little. Just walking from room to room as if I was kind of going from one country to another country to see what might be within it, and not having any idea of what I'd find. And so my dust mountain, which in the previous slide you could see as a tiny little 6-inch high heap, eventually grew into this huge mountain of dirt, out of which I pulled all manner of newspaper cuttings, pottery fragments, and just things which had no value really, but took on the importance of Tutankhamun's treasure whilst I was there, and it was finding something, I'm borrowing someone else's phrase here, but something divine in the ordinary, of things I was picking up, because they had meaning to whoever was there before me. It was their home, and this feeling of home is this kind of recurring theme. I was trying to untangle things, untangle threads, in this case literally. And I've been told about I mentioned the art classes, and embroidery was one of the things the guys did. And I found this really dusty bundle of threads, and when I opened them up they were full of these bright colours, and maybe this is evidence of the embroidery classes that went on here in 1942. They were very dark places actually, and I used to follow the sun around the room. I wake up and sleep with sunrise and sunset, and as the light traversed the room through the window, it was like a searchlight beam, which was quite appropriate in the searchlight tower. And I follow the light around the floor and up the wall, carefully kind of exploring what it was kind of lighting up in front of me. And I'd been there 5 days before I noticed these pin-ups on the wall, which were in the men's sleeping quarters, which is the first room I found myself in. And the room has a sort of asphalt floor, which had taken the impression of the bed legs on the room. And as I cleared the floor, I could see this fascinating map of where the furniture had stood in the room when it had been occupied. And so these little pin-ups are obviously beside some chap's bunk. And mostly it was like this. It was really interior. I thought when I arrived I'd be on the roof looking at the stars and looking at the passing shipping, and it was quite the opposite effect. I got engrossed in a kind of world in miniature inside, and I had my own power, had my own wind turbine on the roof. There were days when the wind didn't blow, and I'd taken something like 6 gallons of petrol for a petrol generator. And I was aware as I used it, as the levels of the petrol went down, it was a finite resource, and so I was in a world with finite supply of oil. And it's like a mirror image of the kind of greater world. I thought, well, yes, if I've got enough oil for 4 more days, and in the world it might be 40 more years, but it was this feeling that I was living in this world where you could actually find approximations of what's happening in the greater world outside. I did occasionally look out at my neighbours, my neighbouring towers, and I think Jamenda mentioned some of the bell sounds. Well, if I have the next slide. Yeah. For the first 2 weeks I was driven mad by the South Mark bell, which in a light breeze will go ting, ting, ting. On the Beaufort scale, I realised that bell had different ringing tones for each degree of wind, and in a gale it had a whole harmonised kind of chiming thing going on, and it was absolutely crazy. So I had a little battery operated radio at 5 o'clock one morning on a Sunday. I put the radio on and tuned in BBC. It's this flipping bells again, and it was a programme called Bells on Sunday. They were broadcasting this early morning, and there's some. So anyway, enough of that. And I eventually got used to it. And I was, as I say, looking at the internal landscape as if it was I was finding ways of looking at every square inch. It was like it would take me a day to explore the top of the table and really look at what was there with a real intensity. And you know, boxes became Pandora's boxes, and what would happen if I opened them, and what might be in them. And I just say the outside sometimes was just a fog, and it would seep in through the windows and make everything wet, and again change the texture of the wall patterns and the colours. Or I might look out through the holes in the floor of one of the rooms and imagine I found my own constellation as something resembling Cassiopeia rising up over the rusty floor. And I started to write about my own cosmology, and I found planets and all kinds of things drifting across the walls. Now this really was maybe the first interfort madness that they've been talking about in 1944. And I was doing the art, so I don't quite know what was happening. There was a washroom, and in the washroom I found the old silver cream sachet, and I think I dated this one actually the 1950s from the design of the packet. And I was going through the bathroom floor very kind of patiently, and I sort of realised that the silver cream packet had got little shaved hairs on it. And so when I found the toenail, I thought I'd put my gloves on. And this was the bathtub, and of course I had to take a bath, and I hauled up loads of seawater from 40 foot below on a rope, and bathed ritually in the Seafort washroom. And all the time I was mapping the landscape as I explored it in sketchbooks, notebooks on the fort, and these I made into these more kind of formal drawings when I got back, which is a kind of record of what might be called the actuality, and in red the things I found that had a particular resonance. And the Seafort website is still there, and you can actually look at the same blog and get a hint of what I was up to in more detail, because there isn't really the time. Yeah, and another one. And people did occasionally visit me, and so there's only 2 more slides. So, visitors would come and see me, and I had 60,000 visitors online for the 5.5 weeks I was there, and maybe a couple of hundred turn up in boats, but of course they couldn't get in, and I'd be kind of pottering around inside, and one day I heard this sound, "Will Stephen Turner please come to the window? Stephen Turner, to the window please." What on earth is going on out here? So I eventually kind of went to my kitchen window, because I thought that's where the noise seemed to be loudest, and I stuck my head out of the window. And the MV Pocahontas, which does Thames River cruises, was out there, about 50 yards away from the tower, and I stuck my head out of the window. About 80 people sat up, click, 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 flashes going on everywhere. And then the next slide. Yeah, after I got back, someone sent me this photograph that they'd taken from the Pocahontas as me waving to them from the side. But really, I'd read a bit about about St Anthony Abbot, who'd lived alone in an abandoned fort for 20 years. And he had the same problem, and he barricaded himself in, but people kept trying to find him and talk to him. But actually the Shivering Sands morsel forts are proof against about anything but spiritual visitation, I think. So if I didn't want to see anyone, they couldn't actually get in. So I was in a sense in the public eye, but my mind's eye was what was concerning me. I realised I wasn't the master in this home, that the forts were never abandoned. They were home to cormorants, who were most annoyed to find me living there when 20 of them arrived and expected to have a nice peaceful evening fishing. And it sort of begs the question of what is our relationship with nature and place? What is our role? I mean, the Victorians would think we were the head of some fantastic chain of being, with people at the top and insects at the bottom in some way, but we're not. We're all equally evolved. And this thing about humility in our relationship with each other and with nature, that means I think if we have more of that, we could find more solutions to the problems we have on this river and elsewhere and in other places. And thank you.